The views expressed on the Final Straw Radio do not necessarily reflect those of Asheville FM, Friends of Community Radio, or any of the affiliate radio stations airing the show. Airing first on Asheville FM, WSFM LP at 103.3 FM in Asheville, North Carolina, this is The Final Straw, and I'm William Goodenough. The show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can email us with questions or suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net. Also, if you are interested in rebroadcasting any episode or segment of the show, you are free to do so. Just send us an email if you end up using any of the content. If you like, you can send us letters at The Final Straw, P.O. Box 6004, Asheville, North Carolina, 28816. This show is brought to you by Firestorm Books and Coffee. Located at 610 Haywood Road, Firestorm Books and Coffee is a worker-owned cooperative in Asheville specializing in offbeat, underground, and independent literature. You can find a sample of Firestorm's catalog of books and zines, plus a full calendar of events at their website, firestorm.coop. This week, we are rebroadcasting an interview that William and Disembodied Voice conducted with Walidah Imarisha, who is an Oregon-based writer, educator, public scholar, and spoken word artist, about her book, Angels with Dirty Faces, 3 Stories of Crime, Prison, and Redemption, her 2016 book out from AK Press and IAS, which highlights 3 distinct experiences that are all in different degrees tangential to the realities inherent to the prison industrial complex. This book won the Creative Nonfiction Award in the state of Oregon earlier on in 2017. In this interview, we got to touch on a wide array of topics, mostly centered on Angels with Dirty Faces, but also on accountability processes and what might have to change in order for them to feel more effective, her relationship to anarchism, and some upcoming projects and appearances. More about Imarisha, her work, and upcoming events can be found at www.walidah.com, and that's WALIDAH. First, though, for all of you who enjoyed our interview with Mango and Marin about anarchist approaches to psychiatry and mental health, there's going to be an anarchist mental health conference in New York City on Saturday, February 23rd, 2019, at Judson Memorial Church at 55 Washington Square South, New York, New York, 10012. The call for proposals reads as follows, quote, 1. Are you an anarchist or other leftist, anti-capitalist, anti-authoritarian? 2. Are you a mental health provider, psychotherapist, counselor, peer specialist, or psychopharm prescriber? 3. Do you have something to share with anarchist mental health workers? A critique of the field, a skill you have, or resource we need to know about? If the answer to these questions is yes, please email an accessible language abstract of 100 or so words to nycamhc@protonmail.com, describing what you want to share, why it's important, and what conference participants will take away from the presentation. Separate from the abstract, please also specify how much time you need, 45 minutes maximum, and what format you'll be using, lecture, workshop, roundtable, long table, etc. Please submit proposals to nycamhc@protonmail.com by December 31st, 2018, end quote. And thanks to everyone who reached out to us about the interview about anarchist mental health. Your comments and feedback were truly wonderful to hear. Keep an eye out for further interviews with Mango and Marin on this and other anarchist and anti-authoritarian media platforms. Next, also, we would like to report on a very concerning and terrible event which took place recently. For the second time this month, someone connected with the James T. Vaughn prison uprising trials has died. For a bit of context from a support flyer at It's Going Down, on February 1st, 2017, inmates at the Vaughn Correctional Center in Delaware took control of their unit and held staff hostage in an uprising that lasted 18 hours. They called the media, released a list of demands, and explained their actions as motivated by their conditions of confinement, as well as the election of Donald Trump as president. One prison guard, Stephen Floyd, was killed by inmates during the uprising." End quote. The remaining prisoners are still facing charges associated with the riot. Kelly Gibbs, the man who passed, was not a defendant in the first trial, but his name was mentioned during that time in connection with the uprising. The implications of these two deaths are all too apparent. Prison workers and wardens often take matters into their own hands in retaliation for acts of prison rebellion. Now it's important to support the Vaughan uprising. We will link to an updated flyer that includes all the names and addresses of the remaining people, as well as to articles for further reading. From the Philly chapter of the Anarchist Black Cross at phillyabc.wordpress.com, calling for court support of the Vaughan 17 back in October. Quote, "In many ways, the demands of the Vaughan 17 anticipated the 2018 national prison strike, calling for increased wages for their mandatory labor and the introduction of rehabilitation and education programs. These comrades positioned their struggle inside against the threat posed by Trump's election, which has now been realized in the increasing detention of immigrants and the rise of fascism on the outside. Since the occupation's end, they have been subjected to extreme repression and violence, including beatings and the denial of basic necessities, including having their water shut off. Yet in the face of these hardships, 17 of the defendants are standing together, unwavering in their solidarity." End quote.
KiteLine is a weekly 30-minute radio program focusing on issues in the prison system. You'll hear news along with stories from prisoners and former prisoners as well as their loved ones. You'll learn what prison is, how it functions, and how it impacts all of us.
Behind the prison walls, a message is called a kite. Whispered words, a note passed hand to hand, a request submitted to the guards for medical care. Illicit or not, sending a kite means trusting that other people will bear it farther along until it reaches its destination. Here on KiteLine, we hope to share these words across the prison walls.
You can hear us on the Channel Zero network and find out more at kitelineradio.noblogs.org.
So we are here with Walidah Imarisha, author of Angels with Dirty Faces and co-editor of Octavias Brood. Thank you so much for coming onto the show. Would you introduce yourself a little bit more and talk a little bit about what you do?
Sure. Thanks for having me. My name's Walidah Imarisha, and I'm an educator and a writer, and I work in a number of different areas, but I see my work all tying together as trying to claim our right to the future and trying to be able to move folks towards imagining and then creating better and more just futures.
Will you talk about your experience of being an educator who is also involved in movement work, and also maybe more broadly about the role of like the academy in movement?
Sure. I think I've been very lucky to teach in places and positions that have allowed me to shape and have as much autonomy as possible around the content of my classes and the subject material. I think that intellectualism is incredibly important in movements for change. I think it's important to have spaces where we are thinking about theory and we're thinking about larger frameworks and questions. To me, all intellectualism should be public intellectualism, which is, in my definition, intellectualism not in service of the powers that be, but in service of the people and in service of creating new just worlds. And to me, the distinction that's very important is about who are you accountable to and who is your work accountable to. And I'm very proud to call myself a public scholar, because to me that means I am accountable to those communities who are marginalized, who are oppressed. I'm accountable to making sure that my work reflects them, making sure that my work is centered in their leadership and their resistance, and that my work inherently attempts to support changing the structures that created that oppression in the first place.
That's really cool. Sometimes I find in like far left at least the strains of the far left that I find myself in, that there's this kind of anti-intellectualism that happens. Do you find that that has been the case for you, or do you have a different experience with that?
I think I've seen, both sides of the extremes. And I think that's part of the problem, is that it's extreme. So I've definitely seen folks who are anti-intellectualism and focused only on practice. I've also seen folks who have only immersed themselves in theory and are not engaged with or thinking about how that moves on the ground. And I think that both of those extremes ultimately keep us from being able to create the kind of change that we want to do. So there has to be a balance. And I also think it's important, again, that intellectualism and that engagement with thinking about the future is really not only rooted in oppressed communities, but includes the imaginings of oppressed communities. So I think it's important that we're not just looking to public scholars to articulate these ideas, that we're looking to public scholars to help create and hold space for communities to articulate these ideas and these imaginings for themselves.
Yeah, definitely. I couldn't agree more. Yeah, the acknowledgement that like intellectual, theory comes from so many different places and not just like out of academies or whatever. Though there are like a lot, is a lot of super useful stuff coming out of academies too. So you've done a lot of like lectures, and you said you're an educator and a writer, and you wrote this book, Angels with Dirty Faces, a couple of years ago. Would you describe this book for anyone who hasn't read it yet?
Sure. It's Angels with Dirty Faces, 3 Stories of Crime, Prison, and Redemption. It's a creative nonfiction book that looks at the criminal legal system, at prisons, and at the idea of harm and accountability through the narrative and the stories of 3 people. And my goal in putting the book out was to create spaces where we can have conversations about the idea of what happens when harm is done. So when there's been harm done in communities, when folks have hurt each other, then what happens? And the book doesn't answer that question, but what I realized in doing my work as a prison abolitionist is that we needed to humanize those folks who are incarcerated, and also folks who have done harm, and they actually aren't necessarily the same people, because those folks have been dehumanized, and we can't begin to have conversations about how to heal communities when we're imagining folks in the communities not as human beings who have made, in some cases, incredibly atrocious mistakes, but as monsters.
Yeah, that resonates a lot with me. And one of the questions that we were really interested about was this kind of disposability mindset that the world at large seems to have for so many people, and that's certainly conditioned on forces of classism and racism and anti-Blackness, particularly.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that when you live in a capitalist society, everything becomes a commodity, including human beings. And I think that, it's very clear that, and I think there's been a lot of amazing scholarship and work done about this, the connections between systems of racial oppression like slavery and the prison system, and recognizing that the prison system is not about safety. It's not about reducing crime. It's about exploitation and control of potentially rebellious communities. And, folks like Angela Davis, Ruthie Gilmore, Michelle Alexander have moved these conversations in the public. And so I think it's important to have a historical and larger framework around it so that we can see it's not just that people are being thrown away, it's that certain folks, especially, are being thrown away because they were never wanted in the first place.
Absolutely. Yes, what you just said about the fact that there are particular folks who can tend to become dehumanized and disposed of in our society is very much true. But what I appreciated about your book and the stories that you tell in it is that you're really approaching it from a space where you're talking about people at times who we actually care deeply for, who create harm and hurt us. And that is something that has often been a conversation in the community that I'm in and that we're in, with things like accountability processes and different ways of trying to address harm at the community level where we don't want to throw people away, right? Mm-hmm. And we'll talk more about that question a little later on in the interview. But I'm curious, because you mentioned prison abolitionism. What do you feel that when we talk about the end of prison, what would need to be true of our society in order for us to stop throwing people away?
Yeah. I think it's, it's important to talk about what abolition is. And I think that, Angela Davis has a great short book that she wrote called Abolition Democracy that's based on the ideas of W.B. Du Bois. And him talking about the fact that, because calling ourselves prison abolitionists is specifically and directly linking back to abolitionists who are fighting against slavery. And Du Bois was writing about slavery and said that, abolition is not just the end of slavery. It is the presence of justice for those who were enslaved. It is the ability to participate fully in society. So it's not just a tearing down, it's actually a replacement and a building up of those folks who had for so long been, exploited and brutalized and terrorized. And I think that that's a very important and useful framing when we're talking about prison abolition, because I think when we talk about prison abolition, often folks think only of tearing down the walls. They think of an absence. And the question becomes, well, then, if you want to tear down the prisons, then what? And I think that for many prison abolitionists, we believe that abolition as a mindset is about ending this carceral mentality, this idea that of punishment and retribution that prisons are founded on. But it's also about creating systems that actually focus on keeping communities whole and safe, and when harm is done, to healing those communities. And so I think it's important to recognize that abolition is not just about destruction. It's also about creation. And Alexis Pauline Gumbs, who is an amazing Black feminist visionary thinker, wrote, "What if abolition is a growing thing?" And I think that idea of abolition as growing, as a garden, as a plant, rather than just as a wrecking ball, is a really powerful one.
Yeah, definitely. So it seems like, it's hard for me to grapple with this question super what might need to be true of our society in order for us to stop throwing people away is a really huge question that I've, sometimes don't really have very great footholds in. The carceral state and capitalism and all of these things like patriarchy, anti-Blackness, misogynoir, all these things build walls between people and, take the element of caring out of the human equation, which is a super huge shame. So I think approaching it like that makes a lot of sense to me. Just to get back to the book, I was really taken with the style that the book was written in, the narrative or creative nonfiction. And I'm really interested about the evolution of this book. Would you talk a little bit about how it changed stylistically throughout the writing process?
Sure. So Angels with Dirty Faces focuses on three people's stories. Myself, my adopted brother, Kamiya, who is currently incarcerated in California, and James McElroy, also known as Jimmy Mac, who was a member of the Westies, which was the Irish mob that ran Hell's Kitchen in New York from the 1960s to the 1980s, and also served as hitmen for the Gambino family, for John Gotti, for the Teflon Don. And the book actually began because Jimmy Mack and my brother were incarcerated in the same place and got to know each other. And Jimmy Mack had never done an interview with any journalist, but because of my brother, he agreed to do an interview with me. And through doing that process, he, was like, "Do you want to write my biography?" And I was like, "Yes, this would be fascinating." But as I began to write the biography, I realized that it was something that was growing. I have been doing work around prisons and justice within prisons for, 20 years more than. And I couldn't help but want to bring that into talking about Jimmy Mack, to give it a framework and to be able to give a full picture of these ideas of crime, of violence, of prisons, of justice that are so, racialized, that are so much about class and gender and sexual identity, and are so much used as a method of social control. And so the book just grew from there to include my brother, to include myself, and then to include the work that I've done, which has been a lot around Black liberation, political prisoners. And so I really began to realize that I think the best way to change folks' minds is through stories. And I think that what really causes a deep shift within a person is being able to emotionally connect with someone else's experiences. And I think that is part of the reason that this system works so hard to dehumanize those who it is scared of. Because if we are not people, if we are things, then there's less of a possibility of other folks in society empathizing, connecting, and then seeing the ways that the system functions. And so I felt like sharing those stories would be an important way to create a shift. So the creative nonfiction genre it's just kind of like a giant snatch bag with a lot of things in it. But, my book definitely, it includes statistics, it includes history, it includes analysis. It also includes personal narrative. I'm a poet, so some of the writing incorporates the aesthetic of poetics. So it definitely is a hybrid creature, but I think that that's actually how we live our lives, is seeing everything connected rather than in these neat boxes.
Yes, and that is one of the most remarkable aspects of the book. I can only imagine that this is something that people comment on to you frequently about it. The way that you just charted that evolution of, kind of talking about Jimmy Mack and then realizing that more stories need to be included sounds very natural and organic. And yet the stories that you chose to include about yourself and your brother were highly personal. And I was wondering, because I suppose you could have chosen to talk about some other folks who were incarcerated who you had learned about or corresponded with, but you chose to speak about yourself and your relationship with your brother and your family. I wonder if you could reflect a little bit on the choice to not just to widen the scope of the book from one story to multiple stories, but specifically to those stories.
Sure. Well, as I was, working on what I thought would be the biography for Jimmy Mack, I came to feel that, I was really connected with Jimmy and with this process. I mean, the reason that Jimmy spoke to me was my brother. And, we got to a place where, Jimmy was calling me his niece and said I was an honorary Westie, which I was like, I don't know that I want to do that, but thank you. And, I felt like I was very much a part of the story. And I think that any idea of objectivity is a fallacy in human beings. I don't think you can be objective. And I think that folks who say they're being objective in their writing, in their creation, in their education, teaching, they are either lying to you or to themselves. I think that the most principled thing is to be clear about your subjectivity and to be clear about how your subjectivity affects the information you're presenting, and then allow the reader to engage with it on that level. And so that's what I began doing. And as I was doing that, I was realizing that these conversations around harm, around crime, around violence were things that I was also grappling with personally. And so, my brother was arrested and tried at the age of 16, tried as an adult, and has served almost 30 years in prison at this point. And then, I had actually gone through a failed accountability process, a community accountability process with my partner at the time who had sexually assaulted me. And really recognizing that these stories are not stories that are easy to discuss. These are not stories that there is a neat, simple ending that can be created, but these complicated, messy, difficult, painful stories are the ones we have to talk about, because if we don't talk about them, then any conception of justice that we're creating will eventually derail when we get to places like that. And so I think that, for me, we have to go into those places that make us uncomfortable, that make us scared, that are painful, to be able to sit with the complexities and contradictions of humanity. And I think that's the only way that we can build new systems of justice, new processes to address harm, new ways to keep communities safe, that will actually both be effective and will embody the values and principles that we have and that we want for this new world.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think that point just cannot be overstated. There's no amount of times when, having that information will ever be too much.
Yeah, and I wanted to say that one of the things that really challenged me in the book, when you talk about sitting with that complexity, was you speak about how, I'm sorry, can you pronounce your brother's name for me again?
Kamiya.
Kamiya. That you talk about how Kamiya really resisted becoming an informant and really didn't want to play that role, but eventually did, and that was really painful for him. It was difficult for you, and it really made me sit with the complexity of that, because I think in the circles that I run in, there's this kind of anti-snitch kind of thing, and it's this very knee-jerk, very all or nothing kind of approach that can just be so harsh toward people who do that. And on the one hand, yes, it's a decision that we can condemn, but on the other hand, it's also you capture the horrible choice of that so well in the book. And so I just wanted to say that, just for me, that was a moment where the story really forced me to sit with that complexity. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks. And I think that I just want to be, Kamiya is anti-snitch and, hates himself for debriefing, and also probably wouldn't be alive if he hadn't debriefed. And both of those things that are in seeming contradiction with each other are absolutely true. And I think that it is important to take into account context. I think that one of the many things that is so flawed with the criminal legal system is the idea that people fit neatly into categories and human interactions fit neatly into categories. And so we can predict what needs to happen when a situation occurs. And I think one of the things that's really powerful about the idea of transformative justice, which is, part of, prison abolition is part of that, is the idea of saying, as we're living the values we have for this new world, how are we respecting that every human interaction is different, is unique, and how are we responding to that and creating situations that address that moment. And I think that's one of the things that is so both challenging and powerful about transformative justice, is that it accepts that each situation is unique.
I'm wondering about what the reception of the book has been, like either critically or, if you've done book events, like how have people received the book?
The reception has been really good for the book. I think I definitely was very nervous about putting out the book for many reasons. Because the book is so deeply personal for myself and for Kamiya and for Jimmy Mack, as well as other folks whose stories are partially told in the book, I wanted it to be as honest as possible. And I tried to be honest and accountable to those folks. Jimmy and Kamiya read different versions of the book. They got to see the book and give feedback on it. And I felt that was very important, especially writing about folks who are incarcerated where so much has been taken from them. I did not want to take their stories and their experiences from them as well and use it to my own ends. So even though I worked to try and make the book as honest and as real as possible, that also meant that all of us are kind of laid open for the world, which was, a very scary idea, I think. And the response to the book has been really incredible and powerful. It's, I think, what has honored me the most is when folks whose families members are incarcerated, people who have been incarcerated, and folks who are survivors of sexual assault all say that they felt like they saw themselves and their experiences reflected accurately in the book, and that the complexities of that, which they live with every day, was something that was, in the book. And that to me was the highest honor that I could receive in relationship to the book. But the response has been powerful from all sectors, and I won the Creative Nonfiction Award for the Oregon Book Awards in 2017, and that has kind of given a new round of interest in the book. So it's been really powerful to use the book as a way to have conversations in communities and as a way for communities to begin having that dialogue of saying, well, then what do we do? And what can we create now that can be ready when harm happens in our community?
Definitely. And yeah, congratulations for the award. And speaking for my own self, one of the most, powerful aspects of the book, which seemingly I'm not alone in this, the fact that you name all of these really difficult complexities that are just inherent to human interaction and, the question of snitching and the question of the accountability process. Those were really, really powerful moments and like very, very real. And I'd love to hear so the reception has been good, but I'd love to hear, has Kamiya or Max or even your situation have there been any material changes to any of y'all's lives or situations because of Angels with Dirty Faces?
Well, unfortunately, Jimmy Mack passed away before the book came out. So
okay.
It is one of my biggest regrets that he didn't get to see the book
Gotcha.
out in the world. And I worked hard with Kamiya because he is still trying to, make parole and get out of prison, to, protect his identity as much as possible around that. But he has shared the book with folks who are also incarcerated with him. And that has meant a lot to me because the book is very personal about him as well. And he has felt comfortable enough to share that with folks who have all given positive feedback to him about it.
That's awesome. You touched on accountability processes several times, and they are kind of the thorn, kind of a thorn in the side of the far left in a way, and they probably don't work as well as we like to believe that they work. I was wondering if you could reflect on accountability processes a little bit and kind of talk a little bit about, can we boil down the failure of these processes to individual flaws, or is there some sort of structural component, that structural aspect to their consistently, lukewarm results?
I think one of the biggest things, and I talk about this in Angels, I think a lot of the problem is what we consider to be failure and success, and how we are judging community accountability processes, especially when it has been serious harm that's been done especially around intimate violence and sexual violence. And I think that we have the idea that is very much, a product of this, capitalist society, that we can find a quick fix for these things, and that we can create something that at the end of the day, everyone will feel healed and will feel whole and will move on from. And I think that those are fairly unrealistic expectations. I think that there is no quick fix to healing, and there is no quick fix in the process of transformation. And so, for me, what I've really come to think about is, are the individuals and is the community at the quote unquote end of the accountability process healed enough that they are able to continue their healing and growth and accountabilities in a less formal structure afterwards? And I think that if that was one of the criteria, we may see accountability processes very different. But I think that, we have to begin shifting the ways we talk about harm that is done, the ways we talk about who is doing this harm, because I think that, and I think things like the Me Too campaign and this response to individual men who have committed sexual assault and sexual harassment is, we have to see that it is pervasive, that it is something that happens. We often talk about how many, women and gender nonconforming folks have experienced sexual assault, but we don't talk about how many folks are assaulting, right? And I think that we have to talk about that, because that is where it is most awful and uncomfortable to think about people in our lives, people we care about, people we respect, who are committing this harm. And yet that is the case. And if we don't talk about that, we can't begin to actually transform our communities. And then we just rely on these individual instances and our response to them, which will continually feel inadequate unless we begin to really shift how we're thinking about it and have these larger conversations about the culture and the pervasiveness of intimate violence and sexual violence.
You touched on #MeToo and other initiatives which highlight survivors of sexual assault. I was wondering if you had any more reflections on how much they break from normative narratives, or alternatively, do they uphold narratives, or is that not really a helpful framework for thinking about that?
I am of the mind, my co-editor for Octavias Brood, Adrienne Marie Brown, talks a lot about growing possibilities. And so I think that there is no one right way to do things. I think that there are actually, we live in a quantum universe, so there are infinite possibilities and to me, infinite ways to create justice. And so for me, as long as folks are holding on to the values and principles, I think that the work should and can move in many different ways. So, when we do Octavias Brood, we do workshops and we ask folks to practice saying yes and rather than no but. I think that we live in a no but society. There is one right answer, so then all the rest must be wrong, right? This dichotomy, which creates hierarchy, rather than saying yes and all of these things can be true, and therefore there is no hierarchy. It's decentralized. It's all here and accessible. And so, I'm thankful for the campaign. I'm thankful to the Black woman visionary who created and held that campaign for 10 years before it saw, this kind of mainstream resurrection. I think I've seen many positive things come out of the campaign. I think there are great conversations that are happening. And I think that, to me, it is about capturing moments. And so I think that this is a moment that we can be using to ask these bigger questions, so that it becomes about how do we fundamentally change, a rape culture? How do we fundamentally shift the ways that institutional oppression have been ingrained in this? And how do we envision and begin to build something different?
Absolutely. And I'm not surprised that in speaking with you, I hear you asking all these questions and really posing kind of how you think about the world in question form, because that really came across in the book, in Angels with Dirty Faces, is that it really feels like the whole book is about posing questions. And certainly for folks who are familiar with your other work, that also questioning is very much a through line in the way that you do your work. And to us, we felt that questioning and kind of seeking out more conversation and not seeking closure is very much an intrinsically anarchist thing. And we were wondering if you would talk a little bit about your relationship to anarchism.
Sure. Yeah, I definitely think that asking questions is incredibly important for many reasons. And, a number of folks have been disappointed by the book because they're like, you just asked questions. You didn't give us the answers. I'm like, boo, if I had the answers, I would have done something a long time ago. But I also think, even more importantly than that is the understanding and importance on the value of collectivity and recognizing that no one person is going to have the answers. And anyone who says that they have all of the answers is lying to themselves or to you. And I think the recognition that it is part of that collective process that will ultimately help us build different futures and come up with new questions. Because this movement for change, there's no end point. It's a continual revolution in the fundamental sense of that word, of continual movement. And, I think some folks could feel depressed about that. I choose to feel incredibly hopeful because it means that we continually have the opportunity to ask ourselves, is this the world we want to live in? And we continually have the opportunity to re-envision the parts of it as we grow that we also want to grow. And so to me, those are a lot of my principles and values. And I do, believe that the ideas of anarchism can be useful and helpful. And so, I identify politically closest as an anarchist. I also think that, to me, if a label is useful in encapsulating ideas in a way that helps move work forward, then use them. And if it doesn't, then keep the values and principles and, move on. And also, as a Black woman, I want to recognize that a lot of what we call anarchism, which, we think of as being created by these old European white dudes, are actually principles and values and ways of being and ways of knowing that communities of color have practiced for eternity. And so I also think, it's important to acknowledge and recognize that this information is not something that is separate from oppressed peoples. It is something that actually comes from oppressed peoples, and that in many ways it's about, time traveling and having those values and principles help us to inform and envision different futures.
I love what you said about the label being useful only if it moves the work forward. And that actually reminds me a lot of things that I've heard people, particularly who do prisoner support, say, because it is a space where you're offering solidarity and you're offering support, and sometimes you're offering it to people who aren't ideologically on the exact same page as you, and it becomes an evolution of your relationship to that person and the reasons that you're in relationship with them. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, beyond just like your brother and who you write about, your experience with supporting incarcerated people, and like maybe just kind of your best practices around that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I have a checklist, but I think for me, I have been incredibly lucky and honored to learn and be mentored by many different folks who have been and are incarcerated, and to work in solidarity and as compañeros with those folks. And I would not be the person I am as a human, as someone involved in change, or as an artist without the mentorship and guidance and leadership of folks who are incarcerated. And so for me, I think it's important to see folks who are incarcerated, who you are engaging with, as A, part of the community, because they absolutely are, and B, as, folks you are working with rather than helping or working for. And I think that a lot of folks who get involved come in and are often, white folks. They come in with a savior mentality, and folks who are incarcerated, and more broadly, people of color, do not need saviors, they need allies. Because some of the most courageous, innovative, incredible organizing work is happening in prisons, behind these walls, in some of the worst conditions possible. And we on the outside have so much to learn, and we need that wisdom, we need that leadership, we need that ingenuity and creativity and bravery. And so I think it's important to come from that perspective rather than coming from the perspective of, I'm doing this to help this person. Rather, coming from the perspective of saying, I'm doing this because we're both in a shared struggle, and this person has a lot to share with me about that. And I want to be in communion and in conversation with this person to be able to make our communities and our world better.
Absolutely. Thank you for that.
Yeah, definitely. Perhaps to veer off topic just for a moment, you've mentioned Octavias Brood throughout this interview, and this is an anthology of speculative fiction that you co-edited. Will you talk a little bit about how this project compared to Angels with Dirty Faces, like similarities, differences?
So Octavias Brood, Science Fiction Stories from Social Justice Movements, is an anthology of fantastical writing by activist organizers and change makers. So it's science fiction created by folks who are doing work on the ground to envision different futures. And my co-editor, Adrian, and I created the anthology with the premise that all organizing is science fiction, and therefore all organizers are creators and visionaries of science fiction. Because these worlds that they are trying to imagine, a world without borders, a world without prisons, a world without sexual violence, that is science fiction, because we haven't seen that world. But also recognizing we need imaginative spaces like science fiction, where we can explore beyond the boundaries of what we're told is possible, because we can't build what we can't imagine. Imagination is the first step to new worlds. And so we have to have spaces where we can throw out what we've been told is realistic and possible, and instead start with the question, what do we want? What is the world we want to live in? And this project has been incredible. It's something, we spent 5 years putting the book out, and it is something that has helped me be more visionary in my life and in my work. And I very much see Angels with Dirty Faces as connected with that. And it was funny because I worked on Angels with Dirty Faces for 10 years. So I started it well before we even had the idea of Octavias Brood, but it came out after Octavias Brood. And so when I would tell people, oh, I have a book coming out, and they're like, oh, is it science fiction? And I'm like, no, it's a creative nonfiction book about prisons and harm. They're like, whoa, that's really different. I'm like, is it? Because in my mind, again, that they're intimately connected, because the reason I think it's important to put out Angels with Dirty Faces is to create the space so that we can imagine different futures. And to me, Angels with Dirty Faces is about helping to cultivate the values that will allow us to build a different world. And so for me, all of my work is connected. And I understand why other folks are like, you just jump around a lot. But I feel strongly that I've hoped that my work is able to embody sort of a visionary ethos and aesthetic that allows to create space for more possibilities, as my co-editor Adrian says.
That's so excellent. You mentioned that you write poetry. Do you write speculative fiction as well?
I do, yes. And I write sci-fi poetry as well. So
excellent. How can people get their hands on that?
I'm still working on it. So I'm working on a book of science fiction poetry that is called Tubman's Uncertainty Principle, and looks at Black women's liberation movements through the lens of quantum physics. So, so nerdy. And I do love the project, because when I tell people, I'm like, I find my folks real quick, because most people's reaction is like, wait now. But the folks like you who are like, oh, I'm like, there you are. There my people are. Yeah. I knew I could find you. So I'm working on that. And I've been working on some science fiction short stories and project as well. So I have some sci-fi stories that have been put out in various places, but I'm still sort of working on putting out more work on that. But right now, my main project is actually a nonfiction historical book on Oregon Black history, because I live in Oregon. So yet again, folks are like, you're jumping to something new. And I'm like, I don't really see it as being very different, but I feel you.
Yeah, for sure. That all sounds super, super exciting. I remember seeing just a YouTube talk that you did, or a talk on YouTube that you did about the racist history of Oregon, and I definitely learned a lot. I think you did it anywhere between 3 and 5 years ago, or something like that, and I got a lot out of it. Those are all of the questions that we had. Is there anything else you wanted to add as part of this interview?
I don't think so.
Well, Walidah Imarisha, thank you so much for coming onto this show for an extremely thought-provoking and incisive interview. Thank you so much for your time and your energy, and for this book you've written. It's been great to have you on.
Well, thanks so much for having me, and for creating spaces to have these conversations. There aren't enough, so I'm thankful for the space that y'all are holding.
To round out the hour, we are going to hear Toad Eater with their track Parasite. Toad Eater is a black metal group from Germany, and this is their first demo. They are opposed to fascist black metal, which is also called National Socialist Black Metal, or NSBM, and support a DIY ethic of music making. You can find their Bandcamp just by going to the site and searching Toad Eater. Enjoy!